Hey everybody, John from the Crafting Brothers here with another video tutorial. I love 3D rollers. I use them all the time in my builds, so does my brother Greg. And I thought I'd make a video and go through all of the different rollers that we use, the ones that we like, the ones that we dislike. Actually, there aren't many that we dislike, but there are different types of material that work better than others, so I think that's the more important thing here. This is by far the hardest foam to work with, this XPS foam. It works great for a lot of different things, like when you're cutting them out for bricks. But when you're using texture rollers, this is a tough thing to use. The most common material that we use is this Dollar Tree foam, and we find ourselves rolling out a lot of patterns on this because it is softer and it takes the pattern really well. So we're going to experiment with those two. And then by far, most of these rollers work better in clay. So anywhere from this natural modeling clay to Model Magic to any of this air dry clay, the patterns from some of these rollers are incredible. So let's go through this. I'm going to take you through all these different kinds of rollers and stamps here and show you how they work on the different materials, and I'll sort of show you what I think works best, and obviously you can judge for yourself. So let's get right to it. Let's roll some textures. First, we're going to have a look at these texture rollers from Green Stuff World. These are actually the first ones we started using. Next, we'll take a look at a variety of different 3D printed rollers used in most of our current builds. And finally, we'll look at these 3D printed stamps, which can be used in a number of different applications. The materials we'll be working with include dollar store foam, XPS foam from Home Depot, Polyform air dry clay, Model Magic putty, and natural air dry sculpting clay. Let's start with the small bricks roller and see how this works on the two different types of foam, and then we'll try it on the clay. Keep in mind that when you're rolling clay, you're going to need some kind of a release agent like baby powder. Otherwise, the roller's just going to stick to your clay. So if you look at these three results here, the XPS foam is the least detailed, the Dollar Tree foam is twice as good, and I think the clay is twice as good as that. Here's an example of some painted brick textures on some of the Dollar Tree foam here. And you can see that the texture comes out pretty good. It's a little bit hard to paint these, but it does work. So I would not use this XPS foam for that type of green stuff roller. I would use the Dollar Tree foam. Next, we're going to try a Cobblestone Roller and see how that turns out. Here again, you can see that the clay picks up most of the pattern, followed by the dollar store foam and then the XPS foam. Let's get into the 3D printed rollers now and see how those perform. This roller in particular was actually part of a large set that is free for anyone to download. I'll make sure to leave a link for that in the description. And again here, clay appears to be the winner. Let's move on now to 3D printed stamps. These have a really unique design which allows you to move the stamp around and line up the edges and texture large surfaces. Here's an example where I used the stamp to texture the side of a tavern wall. The one thing you really can't do, unfortunately, with these stamps is use them on clay. They just tend to stick, even with baby powder. Here's a clear example of that when I tried using my bridge stamp on Model Magic putty. Okay, on to our most frequently used 3D printed brick roller, which I use on all types of materials, including clay and putty. The nice thing about rolling textures into clay is that you don't need to press hard at all, which is why I'm not wearing a glove here. Okay, so if we're comparing the Model Magic clay with the putty, these both come out very similar. I almost want to say that this Model Magic looks a little bit better, and it's probably easier to work with. One of the points that I wanted to make in this video is that you don't really need to have a roller or stamp to create textures. All you need to do is draw your pattern on the foam and use an X-Acto blade to slightly score the lines. Then using a ballpoint pen, you simply trace the lines to define the brick pattern. What I'm going to show you now is a technique where we can take this XPS foam, which doesn't have much surface texture here. We added the lines here with the pen, but we still need more texture here. And I can use tin foil if I want, but to give it a even better texture, this technique with the soldering iron and tin foil wrapped around it does much better, and I'll show you the difference. I use this heated tinfoil technique all the time, and I can't say enough about the results you get after these are painted. So here I'm going to apply the usual tinfoil ball technique and hold these up side by side to show you the difference. It's really just night and day in my opinion. Okay, so I've got all of my rolled samples here, and I've got my XPS foam, I've got the Dollar Tree foam, and I've got the clay pieces here. Before I even start, you can see some of the problems with using clay. It has its advantages, but also it has its disadvantages. For instance, this is the Model Magic Putty, and even though it's a little bit flexible, it does warp. So if you use this, you're going to want to attach it or glue it to a surface as soon as possible so it doesn't start warping on you. This standard modeling clay, which is right here, you can clearly see one of the disadvantages is that these tend to break very easily. Not only that, but they do also warp, and as soon as they warp, then it makes them easier to break. This I like. This is actually the different kind of white modeling clay. Looks like this, and you get that at Michael's or Walmart. It rolls out nicely. It did warp a little bit, but before this dried, if I had it on a surface, then I would be able to use this without any problem at all. So I'll paint this up later and we'll see how that works. Here's another Model Magic stamp that I did, and I'll paint this up and see how that turned out, but it took the imprint really nicely. I'm going to give these all a basic paint scheme, starting with Mod Podge, then pewter gray, followed by a dry brush of granite gray, and then white. These are all my finished pieces with the XPS foam, and you can see that once they're painted up, the texture does still show through. But what I wanted to point out is the difference between these two tiles right here. You can see that the soldering iron and tinfoil technique brings out a lot more texture on the surface than just the tinfoil ball technique. So that is a big difference right there. Okay, so back to the Dollar Tree foam. These all seem to take a pretty good pattern, and once they're painted and washed, the texture shows out real nicely. Whether you're painting foam, clay, or putty, there are many different paint schemes you can use, so I encourage you to experiment with different paint colors and washes until you get the results you want. That concludes this video on texture rollers and stamps. Feel free to send me any comments or questions that you might have, and please subscribe to our channel if you haven't, and spread the word. We'll see you next week with another build or challenge.